All right, I think it is about that time. So, my name is Bethany Pearson. I am the Program and Volunteer Coordinator for the Everett Rail Marshfield Public Library in Wisconsin. I would like to take a quick moment to welcome everyone to this evening's program. I know that we have a variety of people joining us. We do plan the Garden Guru programs focused around Zone 4 and Wisconsin gardening and lawn care. So just as a note, that is what this is targeted for, but a lot of the information will be useful for those outside of that area. So other than that, I just want to quickly note to use the chat at the bottom of the screen if you have any questions or concerns regarding technical issues or general issues or anything like that. If you have a question specifically regarding the topic or the gardening and lawn care in general, use the Q&A function and we will address those. Our presenter is usually pretty good about checking those in between each slide or every couple of slides. So we may not see them immediately, but we will get to them as quickly as possible. Additionally, if it's a question that's very easy, I will answer it while she is, I'll answer it via text while she is talking if it's something that I can answer, but I leave all of the questions that are relevant for her to answer because she's the one with the knowledge. So without going any further, I'm going to introduce Donna. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay, the Garden Guru program is a kind of a joint project between the Marshfield Everett Rail Public Library and the Master Gardener Volunteers of Wood County, Wisconsin. So I'm representing the Master Gardener Volunteers in this partnership. And tonight we're talking about landscaping for less work. And probably most people would like to put in less work in their landscape, but we have to kind of decide what we mean by less. Is it time? Do you don't like to spend a lot of time taking care of the yard and the lawn? That might be one factor that people are looking at. Some people enjoy being outside and do not mind the time that they spend on yard work. Others just want to get it all done as quick as possible. And that's their goal in making less work in your landscape. Another one would be or what would you trade time for? Would you trade it for more expense? These are some things that we're going to talk about. All these factors are kind of interrelated. Physical labor, how able are you to do the physical work involved in yard and landscape care? Some people are able to do that. Some people are less able to do that. And maybe the amount of physical or the kind of physical work that's involved is what you are looking for when you say you want to use less work in your landscape. We also have to look at the chemical impact or the impact of chemicals on your landscape. What kind of plants are you planting? The amount of labor, and these are kind of interrelated because you can spray your lawn with chemicals, which may take a lot less time to do and energy, but is that environmentally more sound? Can you use plants that require less care and management and do not require either chemical or labor to maintain? What kind of desired look are you looking for? What are the values you're desiring to project about your yard to those who view it? Do you want to have a showcase yard? Or do you want to have just an average yard? Or you don't really care what your yard projects about your values? So those are some things to consider. And last of all, hardscaping. Hardscaping includes anything that's non-living. So it could be things like edging, other things that you add to your landscape, paving, that sort of thing, paths through your garden or through your yard. What do you wish to include as non-plant elements in your landscape? Sometimes these things can reduce the amount of work you do to take care of your landscape. But again, then that's a consideration is the cost, because many of these things cost in order to do. And then money, of course, is the last one. So how much are you willing to spend on yard and landscape? Would you trade less money for more time and effort, or vice versa? There's all kinds of ways we can go back and forth with these things. So you have to figure out, which one of these things are you willing to trade for something else. The number one most important rule for cutting down on the amount of time and energy you have to put into your landscape is this rule right here: the right plant in the right place. If you plant something where it doesn't grow well, you're going to be fighting that plant and the care of that plant. If you plant something that's too big for the area, you're going to be always trimming and pruning and that sort of thing in order to keep it where you want it to be. And right along with this is also the preparation before you put in a plant. There's a number 2 rule that says don't dig a $1 hole to plant a $30 or $40 tree or plant. So this little cartoon here is the way some people shop for plants, and I'll give you a minute to take it in. Many people go to a garden center and walk around until they see a plant they like, and then they just have to have that plant. And then they go home and plant it in a spot where they would like to see it planted without regard to the growing conditions in that spot. As a result, they are forced to water a lot, prune it when it gets too big, spray it for disease or insects, or worst of all, watch it die a slow death over several years. Instead, you need to take a note of the growing conditions of the space you want to plant into and use that to determine the best plant for that space. Then when you go plant shopping, you can match the plant to your growing conditions. When you plant, look at the tag on the plant to determine what will be the mature size of the plant. That cute little conifer in its pot might look nice in your foundation planting, but will it grow to be 70 or 80 feet tall when it's only 3 feet from you outside your bedroom window? You might also ask the seller, what is the rate of growth? Is this a fast growing plant or is this a slow growing plant? Some plants take years to reach mature size, and others may reach that size in a matter of year or two. Planting too close together is a big cause for making more work for yourself. You are constantly pruning or trimming and may eventually have to remove the plant altogether. If the plant looks too small for the space at first and it bothers you, you may want to plant some annuals around it until it reaches a larger size. Otherwise, as in the case you see here, you might be doing a lot of pruning. Also consider the form of the plant. Is it a tall and narrow kind of plant, or is it more broad or vase-shaped that may require something planted underneath its bare feet? Will it fit into the area where you want to plant it and complement the plants around it? Another thing to consider is how much sun does that area get? And this is a huge factor in determining a plant. And a lot of people are aware that you can't plant a shade plant in the sun and vice versa. Some plants will not grow at all if the light is not right, or you may have to water excessively just to keep a plant alive if it's in the sun when it should really be in the shade. There are also different kinds of shade too that you need to be aware of. This is a picture of what would be considered deep shade. It looks like an area between 2 buildings possibly, and it looks like it may also have trees growing above. This area is called deep shade. It means it rarely gets any direct sunlight. And so in this area, you would have to grow plants that definitely are shade plants. And just because they're shade plants doesn't mean that they have to be uninteresting. You can see this planting here has plenty of interest, even though it is in a deep shade. This is an example of light shade or dappled shade. And this generally is not completely sunny, but it's not completely shady either. Many plants will survive here except for those requiring very strong sunlight to do their best. By planting in an area that is too shady for the plant, you will find that the plants tend to grow very tall and spindly and may require staking, which in turn means more work. Then there's a shade that we call partial shade. And that's when a plant is on the east or west side of a building or a fence or a tree so that it gets sun only in the morning or in the afternoon. Full sun for those full sun loving plants means at least 6 hours of bright sun a day. This is like the unshaded south side of a building or an open yard with no trees. The next thing to consider is the soil moisture level. Are there low spots in your yard that remain wet? Some pump outlets, rain gutter outlets. As you can see here, this looks like an area where she's standing there. You can actually see kind of a puddle. Certain plants do well in these areas, and some plants do not do well at all. Your yard is probably made up of several little microclimes, and you may have a wet area, you may have a dry area, you may have a sunny area, you may have a shady area. And generally, sunny areas tend to be drier, and shady areas tend to be more moist. However, there are some shallow rooted trees like maples that may make it dry even in the shade. I'm personally struggling to get plants to grow under some maples, which is considered a dry shade area. This is an example of a plant called turtlehead. This plant is planted where the sump pump empties out into the yard. Not many plants can live there where it's wet a lot of the time, but this one thrives in this area. It also likes the shade or partial shade that you see there. By the way, it's called turtlehead because the flowers look like turtles peeking out of a shell. Another thing you might consider is the soil type and the fertility. There are generally 3 to 4 soil types. There's sandy soil, which some people call light soil. The water drains away fairly quickly. It doesn't stand in puddles very long. It dries out fairly quickly. On the other end is clay soil, which some people call heavy soil. It tends to stay wet for a longer time. It tends to be more compact. And when it dries out, it can get like a clay. It's very, very difficult to dig in. In between, and a balance of those two is called loam, which is really about the most ideal type of soil to have of all of them. And then some places are just plain rocky. There's very little soil at all on the surface. Another thing to consider is the fertility of the soil and the pH. There are some parts of the country and even some parts of our state where the soil pH is much more acid or alkaline than other parts. And certain plants grow better in those areas and some grow better in another area. Also fertility, if you have a plant that you always have to seem to be fertilizing all the time, you might do a soil test, which will tell you if there's anything that needs to be done to fix the soil. Sometimes the soil is perfectly fertile, but the pH is too high or too low for the plant to actually use the nutrients that are in the soil. So a soil test will give you the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the soil, and also the pH. And that's a simple soil test that costs usually around $15, $20. Another thing to consider is soil salinity or saltiness. This is something to consider when you're planting near streets or driveways, because the salt from the street or the salt you put on your driveway or your sidewalk can affect plants also. Some plants are very sensitive to salt and some plants take it right in stride. There's nothing that bothers them about it. Another thing you might want to look at is what are the plant's characteristics? And by looking up a plant name, say on the internet, Google the plant's name, you might find some things about it. Does the plant sucker? That means it sends out shoots away from the parent plant a little ways, and so it tends to kind of creep across your yard eventually. Does the plant require deadheading? That means you have to cut off the faded flowers in order to keep the plant blooming. If you don't cut them off, the plant stops blooming. Is the plant aggressive? Generally, this means it spreads either by suckering or it spreads seeds that generally are very quick to germinate, and your one plant might become a whole bed of plants or maybe even into your lawn. Does the plant require special treatment? Is there anything you need to know? Does it have to be covered in the wintertime, for example? Does it have to be sprayed because it tends to have insect pests or diseases? Is the plant an annual or perennial? Annuals, of course, have to be planted every year because they're done at the end of the growing season. Once it freezes, they're done, and then you have to pull them out and you have to start over again the next year. Whereas a perennial is a plant that lives for 3 or 4 or sometimes as many as 100 years, and that never has to be replanted. So there again, time and money are some considerations to look at. However, annuals usually bloom all season long. I'm thinking here of things like impatiens and petunias and that sort of thing. Whereas perennials usually have a season of bloom. They bloom in the spring or the summer or the fall, and then the rest of the year they are without flowers. So that's why it's important to look and see, what does the plant look like when it doesn't have flowers on it? Is it still an attractive plant? Or is this something that you have to cut down in order to make your garden look attractive? What is its hardiness zone? Every plant tag should have on it a hardiness zone. We are in zone 4 here in Wisconsin. When you get down to the southern part of the United States, many places down there are zone 10 and 11, where it generally does not freeze at all or very seldom all winter. If you are planting a plant in a hardiness zone with a higher number than your zone, you're going to have a hard time keeping it alive, and very likely will have to replace it some years, because if we have a really harsh winter, that plant probably will not survive. Many people like Japanese maples, and they're marginally hardy here. And after we have a hard winter, very often people lose the entire plant or maybe a major portion of it, like half of the plant will die. So take heed of the hardiness zone. So you can always go to a lower zone number, that's safe, but a higher zone number is iffy. Does the plant produce fruits or seeds that need to be collected? For example, maple trees produce those little whirligiggy things, and other trees like crab apples and stuff will produce fruits that need to be picked up or raked up or collected in some way. So do the plants produce something that you eventually will have to clean up? And is the plant prone to disease or insect pests? Again, if it's prone to those kinds of things, you're going to have to spend some time taking care of that, either picking off insects or spraying for them or treating for disease or pruning out diseased parts. So those are some things to consider when you research a plant. And then the last thing, do you have a problem with wildlife? Because that's a big consideration in many areas. And if you have to take the time and trouble to always fence things or spray things with deterrents, that's going to increase the amount of work that you have to put into your yard and garden. So what are the solutions to all of this? What are we going to do? Native plants. Okay, why native plants? They are adapted fully to this area's climate. If they are native to the area where you are planting them, it means they have been growing here for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, and they've seen the worst. They've seen the blizzards, they've seen the cold, they've seen the floods, they've seen the heat, they've seen the drought, and they have survived. They require little, if any, watering. Sometimes the first year to get the plant established, you may have to water it. Many native plants have extremely robust root systems, and many of them go down feet into the soil. So they require little or no watering. They know how to survive without it. So they require no fertilizer either. If grown in the appropriate soil type and environment, no fertilizer is needed. And in fact, fertilizing will often cause the plant to get top heavy and flop over and just not look very nice. Their native plants are largely tolerant to wildlife damage. Again, they have been surviving with the native wildlife for hundreds of years. And so they've developed kind of a relationship. Sometimes they will be chewed on by wildlife. If it's an especially severe winter, for example, deer will eat almost anything, and rabbits also. But if it's a normal winter and that type of thing, most of the wildlife damage is not something that is going to be bothersome. They are resistant to insect and disease damage. Again, they have been growing up with the insects and diseases we have here in our natural environment for hundreds of years, and they have adapted to that. So they are not likely to be harmed by native insects and diseases. However, we have some invasive insects and diseases that will attack even the native plants. I'm thinking of things like emerald ash borer and Japanese beetles. Although even the Japanese beetles, I don't see those much on the native plants that I have in my yard. They do not require special care for the most part. Once you plant them and get them started, they do just fine on their own. Native plants are perennials, which means you don't have to replant them every year. They are intimately bound to native insects and pollinators. Again, insects and pollinators have adapted to these plants over hundreds of years. Many of them are the host plants for many kinds of insects, butterflies, moths, and that sort of thing. I just was looking at a video, the butterfly bush, which is not entirely hardy in this area, not butterfly weed, butterfly bush. That plant attracts no native insects, butterflies, moths. It has absolutely nothing that the native wildlife can use. And so that is a plant that came to us from China, and it didn't grow up here with all of these other insects and that sort of thing. So as far as promoting pollinators and that kind of thing, that plant is absolutely useless. You may see some pollinators visiting it, but they are not the host plant for the larva of any of our native insects. And generally, native plants are not invasive in the natural environment. So if you plant, let's say, coneflowers, and even if they get out of your garden and spread to the neighbors, they aren't going to take over everything like some of our native things are. Some of the ones that have gone that way are tansy. If you see the roadsides around here, it's a yellow button flower that grows about 3 or 4 feet tall, and it's just invaded everything. Dandelions are another invasive plant that came here many, many years ago. We kind of think of them as native now, but they weren't. They came here and they got away from the gardens where they were planted and invaded everything. We have garlic mustard. We have Even some landscape plants that are now being considered invasive, like burning bush and Japanese barberry, because they get out of the gardens where people plant them and start invading the natural woods and fields and stream beds and that sort of thing. So these are some of the reasons that to look at native plants as part of your landscape. But how do you incorporate them into your landscape? You say, I've never grown native plants. What do I do? How can I get started with natives? Some of the things you might do are to visit gardens that feature native plants to see what they look like. And you can see where they're growing. What kind of conditions do they grow under? Are they shady or sunny? Do they like wet or dry soil? What type of time of year do they bloom? So that might be one thing. You can tell whether you like the look of that native plant or not. Is it something that you think would look nice in your yard? You can also research easy to grow natives to start with. And again, go on the internet and research some native plants and see if those are sometimes some kinds of things that you might want to use. In the resources that I have with this program, there's also a list of native plant nurseries. Many of those nurseries provide very informative catalogs for you to look at to find out what does a native plant look like, what does it need to grow successfully, is it easy to grow or not, and what is its bloom time, what is its color. So that's another place where you can get reliable information, because most of the native plant nurseries really want you to be successful with the plants. So they give you information that will help you be successful in choosing the plants and then in growing them. Probably the best way to start is replacing a few plants or non-native grasses with some native plants. Let's say you have a plant that is just naturally dying of old age and you want to replace it with something. Look towards something that might be a native plant that would fill in that space. Some people think that all native plants are prairie plants and they have to be tall and very striking and they have to be in the sun, and it's actually not true. There are woodland native plants, wetland plants, you name the environment, there's a plant that grows naturally in it. And another thing to look at is buy from local reputable native plant sellers. Some native plant nurseries are online order only, but if you visit gardens and take a look at what the plant looks like, that will help you decide also. As with all plants, you need to consider the hardiness zone. If you're going to go with natives, I would suggest something that is native to the state or the region where you live. For us, it would be like the upper Midwest, Wisconsin in particular, but very often the plants that grow in Wisconsin also grow in Michigan and Minnesota and maybe Illinois and Iowa. So go with something that's native to your area. And that's usually, if you go on the internet, it'll say where this plant is native to, where do you see it growing in the wild. Look at the plant's size, its height and width, just as you would with any other plant. How fast does it grow? Some native plants take 2, 3, 4, or 5 years to really get going. So if you want something with more rapid bang for your buck, you might go with something that has a more rapid rate of growth. Again, consider the plant form. Is it something that's very tall? Is it something that's short and bushy, so that you know where you might want to put that in your landscape? Look for the sunlight preferences and the soil preferences. Do they like sun, part shade? And the soil, is this a plant that grows normally in sandy soil or clay soil? Wisconsin has a wide variety of soil types. Even in my own county where I live, it's heavy clay, but you get to the other end of the county and it's sand. So a plant that would grow well in the southern part of my county might not do as well in my area. Look at the moisture preferences. If you have a yard that's all in the sun and you have no low spots, you probably want to pick plants that do well in average to dry soil conditions. Tolerance to insects, diseases, and wildlife. Very often, native plant catalogs will tell you whether plants are particularly tolerant to wildlife and that sort of thing. We talked a little bit about the natural range. Does it actually grow here in the wild, or are you picking a native plant from California and you're going to try to plant it in Wisconsin? So you need to know where that plant is native to. And then its cultural maintenance needs. Do you have to prune it or deadhead it or anything? Generally though, that's not a concern with native plants. By the way, a native plant is considered to be something that was growing here before Christopher Columbus and the Europeans set their feet on this continent. So if it was something that was growing here then, therefore, dandelions are not considered a native plant, even though they grow all over the United States. A word or two of caution about buying native plants. Ask the seller how the plants were obtained. Did they go out and dig them somewhere, or did they grow them themselves? Did they collect the seeds from the wild, or have they propagated their own plants with seeds? Where did they get their plants from to begin with? Ask the seller how the plants were grown. They should be grown in a nursery in some kind of controlled growing conditions so that you know that they're not coming from the wild. Make sure the plant is native to your region. You should be able to go out in your wild areas in your area and find this plant growing. Be aware of plants that are transplanted from someone else's garden. And this is a rather recent thing that's come up. If you've heard of jumping worms, they're an invasive worm. In other words, they aren't the normal earthworms we have around here. And what the worms do is they are voracious eaters, and they eat through the soil and take all of the organic matter out of it. And you're left with something that's hard and grainy that looks like coffee grounds. And that soil does not hold moisture, does not hold nutrients. And so one of the chief ways that, whoopsie, yeah, okay. One of the chief ways that these are spread are by sharing plants from someone. If you see plants in a wild area, do not dig or transplant them from wild areas. You can collect no more than 10% of the seed from a wild plant. However, do not take the seed from a rare or a single plant growing somewhere. Take care not to damage surrounding plants when collecting seeds. It's also quite possible to mistake a native plant for something else. The photo on the left is an invasive plant called creeping bellflower. It's not native to the United States. And it looks very much like the picture on the right, which is a harebell. The main way you can tell the difference is the invasive plant, the bellflower, has all of its flowers growing on one side of a stem. The harebell has the flowers growing in groups or clusters around the stem. So you may go out thinking, well, I'm going to pick the seeds off that native plant there. I really like that. And you may end up choosing an invasive plant. Okay, now people say, okay, but aren't native plants kind of weedy looking? Doesn't your yard have kind of a wild look? How do you get it to look like a garden or a yard? Actually, these 4 pictures are all pictures of native plant gardens. And I wouldn't think that most people would classify these as weedy looking gardens. Native plants can be used in gardens just as well as any other non-native plant. The one in the lower right down here is actually an example of a rain collecting area on a roadside. And the plants that are growing in here are selected because they can tolerate both wet and dry soil. So when it rains, this area fills up and it has standing water in it maybe for a day or two. And then it dries out when there is no rain. And the plants here also can withstand both those conditions. And rather than just having a ditch with a big puddle in it and some weeds growing out of it, this is a rather attractive way to retain rainwater from running off and going down your streets and gutters and all that sort of thing. It also helps to filter the rainwater of any pollutants that are in it. I want to show you a, let's see here. A video, and I'm not sure this, that didn't work. Oh, there we go. Okay. So in summary, if you want to cut down on the amount of yard work that it takes to keep your yard looking nice, the number one rule is to plant the right plant in the right place. Know the conditions where you want to plant and then choose plants that thrive in those conditions. Prepare the planting site before planting so that you don't have to try to amend and fix things afterwards. And think about choosing native plants or incorporating native plants. As the man in the video said, you don't have to have all native plants, but incorporating some of the native plants that are native to your area will help you be able to cut down on the amount of maintenance that you need to do. Now a little bit about lawns. I said something about no-mow lawns. No-mow lawn mixtures are a mix of fine fescues, and it's reasonable to have to mow them only once or twice a year. And generally, they do not include perennial ryegrass. This is a picture you see of a no-mow lawn. It has a little bit different appearance. It's kind of more shaggy looking, almost kind of wavy because the plants grow to about 6 inches high and then they kind of bend over. So it gives that kind of wavy appearance. No-mow mixtures do not mean that they're maintenance free. Depending on the kind of mixture that you use, they may sometimes need special or extensive preparation prior to seeding. Sometimes you need to kill the existing lawn and then start with a no-mow mixture. Some mixtures can be seeded into your existing lawn. So you need to do some research on what kind of seed mix you're using and what you need to do to get it started in your yard. Depending on the type of grass, some of them may need some watering in order to keep them alive. Whereas our native bluegrass, most lawns, they go dormant in the summertime, and if you don't water them, that's okay because they'll come back in the fall. They may also need dethatching, again, depending on the type of grass that's in the seed mix. So please be careful and thoroughly research the kind of no-mow mixture you're using before you start in doing anything about that. If you decide that maybe that's not the way you want to go, you either don't like the way it looks or you don't want to invest in starting a new lawn, there's some other tips that we can talk about that will help you avoid less work maintaining lawns. Be sure that you've got the correct type of grass seed seeded in the areas according to how much sun or shade the area has. Shade areas need a more shade tolerant grass. Generally, it has more fescues in it. Sun areas need more sun tolerant grasses, which usually means bluegrasses, that type. Extreme shade, really deep shade, will not grow grass, no matter how hard you try. You can there use a mulch or a ground cover or other shade tolerant plants instead of batting your head against the wall trying to get grass to grow there. High traffic areas may also need a special grass mix that allows for high levels of foot traffic, like if it's really a yard where children play a lot, that sort of thing, that you may need to have a more hardy grass mix. You do not have to worry about getting clover out of your lawn. White clover is a good thing to have in your lawn. It provides nectar for many, many kinds of insects. And it is also very drought tolerant. It doesn't go dry when the rest of your lawn does. It's pretty tolerant to foot traffic also. For lowering lawn care, mow 3 to 3.5 inches high and don't remove more than 1/3 of the blade at any one mowing. Tall blades are much more hardy. They have better shade so there's less chance that weeds are going to germinate in your lawn. They require less watering. They're more drought resistant because if the tops are taller, that means the roots have to be more and deeper, so they're more drought tolerant. When you mow, don't bother picking up the clippings, leave them on the lawn. In fact, if you leave all the clippings on the lawn for a whole season, that's the equivalent of one fertilizing of the lawn. Have your mower blades sharp. That saves on gas and energy, and it's better for the lawn also because instead of shredding the leaf blades, it cuts them cleanly, and that keeps the grass from losing moisture. You should fertilize, though, at least once a year because a well-fed lawn means less weeds. And the more you fertilize, however, if you're fertilizing 3 or 4 times a year, you may also have to do some watering in order to keep the grass alive in the summer. So rather than doing that, settle for once a year fertilizer and allow the lawn to go dormant in hot, dry summers. I'm glad to see that at least around where I live, there's nothing that says you have to keep your lawn green all summer. I know in some areas there's probably rules about, you have to keep it green, or there's pressure from neighbors and neighborhoods and that sort of thing. But it will come back unless we have a really severe dry summer. It will come back. Something that might save you a lot of time trimming is to put in mowing strips or edging of some kind. And again, this is a trade-off where it's going to probably cost you some money to do this, but it may save you a lot of time in the end and not having to do a lot of trimming. Mulching an area around tree trunks also, so that you don't have to go back and trim around trees. Trimmer damage is one of the main causes for deaths of trees, especially young trees. You get too close. On the other hand, a word about mulching. Don't pile up the mulch against the bark of the tree. You don't want a mulch volcano. Keep it away from the bark of the tree. Otherwise, there's too much moisture there and the bark will start to kind of rot and you could kill the tree. So some mulch doesn't have to be like terribly high or thick, but that will cut down from having to go around and trim around all those trees. Gardening, garden beds, flower beds or whatever. Mulching is a good thing to do. It protects the soil surface, avoids runoff and heavy rains, suppresses weeds. They're generally easier to pull out of mulch than they are to pull out of the ground. And an important consideration is water retention. It keeps you from having to water as often. And that's a lot of work for some people. Organic mulch is best. That includes things like wood chips, compost, straw, shredded leaves, coconut hulls. I would very strongly avoid using inorganic mulches like stones. They collect extra heat around the plants and still have to be blown free of leaves and weeded. And sometimes weeding the stones is more difficult than weeding even bare ground. Do not use landscape cloth underneath. It's not going to save you any work. Eventually, the organic matter that goes down through the stones is going to collect on top of the mulch, and that becomes a really good place for weed seeds to germinate. So that's not a good idea. Also, if you cut a hole and plant a plant in it, as the plant grows, the landscape cloth can actually like choke the plant and keep it from growing out, or also may even kill it if it's too tight around the plant. Again, edging at the edges of garden beds between that and the lawn will help to keep grass from growing into the garden beds and also make it easier for mowing because there's a distinct edge there. But again, a lot of these things require money. So again, you're going to trade the time that you may be having to spend maintaining it with some cost that might be involved. Tree and shrub care for less work. Choose an appropriate type and size of tree or shrub. Again, if it's too big for the space where it eventually grows, it's going to run into other things that you have in your landscape, and you're going to have to keep pruning it down. Choose shrubs or that type of thing for hedges that do not necessarily have to be trimmed all the time in order to keep them looking good. Natural shaped plants that have a good shape for a hedge will make it less work as far as trying to keep that hedge looking nice. Know the diseases and insects that a tree is prone to. Some of them are much more prone to diseases and insects than others. And again, going with native trees, if you have to replant a tree or replace a tree, consider something that is native to our area. Oak trees they do get a disease called oak wilt, but as far as being good for the environment, oak trees host, we were talking about plants that host insects and their larvae. It hosts over 500 different insects. And so that's one of the best trees that you can plant. It does take some time to grow. An oak is not a fast growing tree, but it is very good for the environment and biodiversity. And again, consider, does the tree scatter large amounts of seed or other debris that you're going to have to be cleaning up after all the time? Dealing with fall leaves. You can mow over the leaves on your lawn with a mulching mower or even a regular mower. And as long as you can see the grass, the shredded leaves will not harm the lawn. You can leave them on there. They will disintegrate and provide nutrients for the grass. If you have really, really thick layer of leaves, then you may have to actually do some raking. But it may be easier for some people to mow more often than it is to rake the leaves. So you can kind of think about that. Would you rather rake or would you rather mow? If you have a large amount of leaves, mowing them or blowing them onto your driveway and using a lawnmower to run over them and shred them, then you can use those shredded leaves as mulch around your yard plants rather than having to haul them away to some waste site. You can rake and bag the whole leaves and use as insulation around your foundation. Tuck them in behind your foundation plants and nobody will ever know they're there. Then next year you can use those bagged leaves to add to a compost bin with the following year's greens in order to make compost, which in turn goes back into your gardens and your lawn. Another option is to pile them in the corner of a yard and allow them to make leaf mold. In other words, you just let them there for a year or two until they decompose, and then you can use that for compost. So any way that you can deal with leaves that is less work for you, it takes less energy, less gas to drive them to a composting site, city composting site, or having someone come and pick them up. It just makes sense to use them in your yard and to take care of them in the easiest way it is for you to do. Let's see, any questions? I don't see any open questions, anything in the chat.
They've been very quiet this evening. So if you have any questions, be sure to use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions on any of the things that Donna spoke about this evening, or if you just have any questions about anything else that you're currently dealing with, that is also acceptable.
Another thing, other topics that you would like to see addressed in the future Garden Guru programs, you can type those into the question and answer area or the chat box too. We're always looking for new ideas.
Well, we give it a moment or so to see if anybody has any questions. I do have a bunch of resources that I've dropped into the chat. You can also, I'm going to be putting all of these in an email that I will send out as well.
If you're looking for more information on native plants, just Google native plants, gardening with native plants, things like that. One of the things I also want to talk about, for accurate research-based information on any topic, you can put in your question and then follow it with the word extension. So for example, if you were looking up things on lawn care, you put in lawn care extension. That's what you put in your Google search. And this is good for all topics from children to food to farm crops, because what this does is bring up articles that are research-based from extension colleges and universities all over the United States. And so you know that you're getting good information there, and it's not some, you know, somebody sitting in their house, you know, writing a blog on gardening and they don't even have a garden in their yard. So this is one way to get really good information. I always want to share that every time because, you know, if you can't get an answer from anybody else, you can probably get it that way. And if you can't get it that way, then go to your county extension people. Wild ones, yes, that's a good source also. Let's see, what to do to protect new garden bed areas from bird seeding. Mulch will help. Knowing what you've got planted in there and what doesn't belong there, and keep weeding. Yeah, birds are good at bringing in all kinds of seeds from all kinds of different places that we don't know where they sometimes came from. So I would say mulching would help. Yeah, in Appleton, you say the Wild Ones has an annual plant sale in May. I believe the UW Arboretum also has a native sale in the spring. So that would be another place where you could get native plants if you don't want to go the online route and ordering that way. I think there are some garden centers that are starting to bring in more native plants, but again, you know, you probably have to be more careful about what you get there because they're not experts in native plants. So you got to kind of know what you're doing, what you're getting.
All right, do we have any other questions or comments this evening? Oop, looks like a yes.
Ways to garden in the winter. Okay. Yep, that would be something. It's Peggy, do you want something that you're growing inside the house, or ways that you can like winter sowing where you actually plant the seeds like in milk jugs and just leave them out in the garden? Any other questions, comments?
I think we can probably call that good for the evening then. Oh, we have some more here.
Okay, so inside gardening. Yep. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Barb, and thank you, Peggy. Thank you to pull this up. Kim, thank you to everybody else for joining us this evening. As I said, I will be sending out another email. It's going to have all the information that I had included earlier. So it will have the link to the Google Drive folder. It will have the link to the YouTube so that you can check out all of the archive videos, including this one if you missed any of it or if you had to leave early or anything like that. And I'm also going to include the link to the video that Donna included in this, because I think I'll have to crop that out of the YouTube video since I might get in trouble for having that on our YouTube channel. So, but all of that will come out to you. I will also have a survey. It just has a couple of questions. If you think of any ideas or if there's anything that you think could be improved on this, you can include that information right in the survey. So thank you to everyone for joining us. Have a great evening.